Drive sober.
You're watching Rogers TV.
Welcome to this episode of Food Bites. Naheed Nenshi is one of Canada's political luminaries. Now, he won't like me saying that, but he was three terms as the mayor of Calgary, and that's my hometown. It's also where he grew up. And he really did some interesting and wonderful things, and I really wanted to get him on the show because we've been talking about cities and other things, and we'll talk about that. But just as a bit of a background, he went to the University of Calgary, and then he went to Harvard, to the John F. Kennedy School of Governance, and graduated from there in 1999. Then he came back to Calgary and got involved with all sorts of different things. And then in 2010, he decided to run for mayor, and the results are now well known to everybody else. He won. There were a lot of candidates in that election. I followed it pretty closely. A lot of candidates, and Naheed won, and it was great. And as I said, he said three terms there. But he's, since then he's announced that he's going to be moving into running for the leadership of the NDP party in the province of Alberta. That's going to be a challenge. I know there's so much going on there, and that he's just the kind of person that could help sort out some of the things that are going on. Anyway, here he is, and I'm delighted, Naheed, that you came. Thank you for doing so.
Well, thank you. You forgot to mention I'm also the #1 Glen fan in the country, and I'm thrilled that we're finally getting a chance to talk on your show, and thank you for everything you do in London and beyond. No,
that's good. Do you remember where we first met?
Oh, gosh. I've met you a few times, but I can't remember the first one. What was the first one?
I was an MP, and it was back in, I think, 2007 or 2008, and I was speaking at the University of Calgary on an international development forum that was there. And I brought my daughter a chin. She had just arrived in Canada, didn't speak English, but I brought her along with me on that trip. So we spoke there, and you were there as well, and they introduced you. And I think at that time you were at Mount Royal College in Calgary. And so I spoke and you spoke, and I just remember thinking, this guy is really smart. Like, he's really smart. I'd had a lot of experience, but your intellectual acumen was really impressive to me. And I really enjoyed that time. And you were great to my daughter that day as well.
Thank you for reminding me of that. There was life for me pre-politics.
Yes. But do you remember that, though?
I remember she had just arrived, and she was a bit shell-shocked at where she was, right?
No, that's really true. And then I had you come down to London a number of years ago to Emerging Leaders Conference. And you came down and spoke at that at our convention center, which I really appreciated. And then I really enjoyed a couple of years ago, you and I were at the Governor General's Leadership Conference.
Wasn't that a great event out in Muskoka, Ontario?
Yes.
And with a bunch of leaders, I wouldn't say emerging leaders, I'd say real leaders.
Yeah.
From across the whole country. It was just energizing and exhilarating. And I had a crazy week. I had been in 4 different cities across time zones. I hadn't slept in days, and I just showed up at this thing. And if you recall, there was a party at the lakeside home of one of the wealthiest people in Canada, and Jim Cuddy was playing, and I was thinking, what am I even doing here? Mm-hmm. But it was a wonderful thing.
But you spoke there, and it was awesome. I think it helped me to realize, too, that there were a lot of Indigenous youth leaders there. Obviously, because the Governor General, Mayor Simon, had asked them to come. And but I remember you spoke, and there was a real interest from them. I was part of a session afterwards, after you spoke. And I remember how you really connected, Naheed, and I think you still do. But I think it's the idea of innovation, of looking at things differently, not looking at money to solve everything, but the human quotient, the human resource and potential. You spoke so well at that, and I just remember that, how that affected the young people. So Jane and I had a great time with you there. We really enjoyed it. It was for a few days. I know you were burned out a bit. I could see that as soon as I saw you, but it was a really good session, and it did give us a bit of hope for Canada, right? Because some of that youth movement was pretty strong.
Yeah, it was quite a wonderful thing. And, I continue to do work with young Indigenous people, mostly here in Southern Alberta, but, a little bit across the country, on finding their voice and finding their role as warriors in their own community, new kinds of warriors. And I've been very encouraged that I've been able to create wonderful relationships with the Indigenous communities in these areas. You can see some of the things I've been gifted in the back of the frame here. But I have my Blackfoot name I cannot pronounce, because the Blackfoot people are known with great senses of humor, and Elder Pete Standing Alone gave me a name I cannot pronounce, but it translates to clan leader, he who moves camp and the others follow. And the Tsuut'ina people, the Beaver people of Southern Alberta, gave me a name that translates to always ready, which does not mean, as anyone who knows me knows, always on time. But when I finished being mayor, when I was just finished being mayor, before I embarked on the new chapters of my life, I was gifted a war bonnet, a ceremonial eagle headdress.
Wow.
And as part of that ceremony, one of the elders, Reg Croshoe, who I call my Uncle Reg, said to me, this is not a thank you gift. It is not a valedictory. It is to remind you that you have to continue to be a warrior for all people going forward. So I've spent the last 2 years, with Uncle Reg's permission, giving that charge to other people, saying that all of us are called upon to be warriors in our own communities, warriors for one another, something that you and Jane have been doing for so very long. And I hope that we can spread. I used to say spread the virus, but in these late stage pandemic times, I shouldn't say that anymore. But I hope we can spread the concept of community service, what I call seva. It's a Sanskrit word that means selfless service.
Yeah.
And if we can spread the concept of seva through our communities, I think that's where we will have real power in making change in these uncertain times.
Yeah, that's interesting. My dad and I, we worked with the Blackfoot Nation there, the reserve that was west of Calgary, because we lived in Western Calgary, and he was always very strong at that. But that's interesting to hear you say that. I'm so glad. It was such rudimentary days back then. Like, they were trying to get all the Blackfoot people to come into the Calgary Stampede and do all of that kind of stuff and be part of that image that Calgary was trying to present. On the other hand, it wasn't all just image. I remember I was 5 years old. I came over from Scotland. I'd been born in Calgary, but I came back from Scotland when I was 5, and my dad took me down to the city hall there to register me there as a new resident of Calgary. And we arrived, and there were hitching posts at the front of City Hall, and there were some horses there tied up, not many, but they were tied up. And I remember, as a boy from Scotland, just thinking, what is this, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of that in Calgary, too, of its history and other things.
Now just horse statues in front of City Hall,
Yes.
But yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, the reason why I asked you to come on, and I appreciate you doing so, that I know how busy you are with the provincial campaign for leadership going on. But Naheed, I know back in 2002, you had written a piece about, I think, was it a book about Canadian cities and the resources that they have, and also the young entrepreneurial class and the resources that they would bring to cities. And, I have been, I don't want to go all over it, but, I've been talking with a number of mayors and others over the course of this show, but also over a number of years. And it just feels to me like cities are getting squeezed so bad. And as a result of what's happened in the pandemic, it's almost cemented the emergency that it's that bad. So when I was talking to Mike Savage, for instance, he was saying, Glen, it's homeless in all the cities across the country. Like, it's really, really hard. But I mentioned to him, and I bring this up at the beginning to show you how foolish I am, but also so that you can help guide the audience a bit better than I did. But I said to Mike that I was speaking at an FCM conference a number of years ago, saying how I really felt that the Canadian system of federalism was no longer suitable in its current form. we are a federalist nation. I get all of that. But this whole idea that when it was crafted, during around Confederation time, 90% of the population lived rurally. Now it's close to that live in communities or cities, mid-sized cities, small cities. And yet the realities of that federalism when it comes to resources did not translate along with those populations as they migrated and moved. So you end up with the situation where the feds or the provinces have so much clout in that way about the delivery of resources and legislation. And the cities, which have all the challenges, but also all the potential, have little opportunity to be able to cobble together the kind of things that are necessary to make the change. Mike Savage was a little bit shocked that I said that. And he said, Glenn, we don't want to get into that because that involves changing the Constitution and everything else. He said, what we really want to do is we want to find a new way of doing things and pulling people together, the private sector, so on and so forth. So I just said to him, how's that going for you? And it wasn't great, right? So I think you could really school us. You've written on it. You understand this so much better than I do. But what is the answer for Canadian cities? I think you would even look at it a bit different now than you did in 2002.
Yeah, well, until yesterday, I would have agreed with both of you and Mike Savage in terms of the Constitution does not match the reality of urban life. Canada is, in fact, one of the most urbanized nations in the world. Yet, even when you look at all of our tourist advertising, it's all about unspoiled landscapes and mountains and mounties and horses and things like that. But in fact, we're a very, very urban nation. Our constitutional and our fiscal federalism do not match that in any way. But I would also have agreed with Mike, which is it's not worth talking about it. We just got to get our work done as best we can. But we're recording this one day after the Alberta government has put forward a shocking piece of legislation. They call it Bill 20, which basically imposes the provincial government's will over the municipal governments, over the democratically elected municipal governments. It gives them the power to disallow any municipal bylaw, fire any municipal councillor or mayor at whim, changes a bunch. It even has some conspiracy theory stuff in it. It gets rid of the use of electronic vote tabulators and also introduces municipal political parties. The whole thing is a mess. It is born completely out of revenge, because the cities of Calgary and Edmonton didn't vote the way that the provincial government wanted them to vote. But it just gives you an example of how fragile the situation of municipal governments, duly elected municipal governments, is in this country. That any province can just do this. And I was having a hypothetical conversation today on what legal recourse is there. And I have been waiting for years and years and years for a provincial government to do something so egregious that the Supreme Court would end up writing in municipal rights into the Constitution the way they've done, for example, with 2S LGBTQ plus rights.
Yeah.
There was one example in Ontario where it very nearly happened, where Doug Ford cut the size of the of the Toronto City Council in the middle of an election period.
Yeah.
And that only passed through the Supreme Court on a 5-4 vote. So the Alberta government may well have now put forth the thing that will finally get municipalities into the Constitution. Who knows? It's going to take some bravery and some smart lawyers to move that forward. But it just shows you how little power the municipalities have. And just before we recorded this, I was listening to a call-in radio show. And, one of the people on the show said, well, the provincial government just wants the cities to stick to snow removal and stop signs. And the response was the cities would be thrilled if they could stick to snow removal and stop signs.
Yeah.
And the problem is that we have to deal with homelessness. We have to deal with mental health and addiction because it hits us on the streets where we live. We have to deal with housing. We have to deal with investments in public transit. We have to deal with climate. We have to deal with poverty. Because for too long, the provincial and federal governments have been completely absent in these conversations. The recent interest in the federal government in housing, as you well know, Glenn, took place some 30 years after the federal government had completely abandoned its role in housing. Yeah. And so it's interesting to see these conversations happening now But at the same time, the cities are where where all the problems happen, where the good things happen too, where the rubber hits the road, and the cities have neither the money nor the power to be able to actually deal with the issues that we're facing every single day. But no one else is dealing with it. So, the number one, people think the national sport of Canada is hockey. It's actually lacrosse. But I will tell you that the actual national sport of Canada is buck passing, where the federal and provincial and municipal governments all day go, oh, I would love to help you, but that's their responsibility. Yeah. Oh, I would love to help you, but they have to give us money. And in the end, no one gets helped. Yeah. And so if this crisis moment between municipalities and their provincial governments can lead to something good, perhaps it will lead to the municipalities having both the power and the money to actually do their job. Yeah. I'll just say one fascinatingly different thing between Alberta and Ontario is that in Ontario, the Conservative government empowered the mayors in the cities to get more housing built in particular, but more broadly, because they wanted to get out of stuff. And in Alberta, the opposite is happening. The provincial government is disempowering cities and setting themselves up as gatekeepers because they don't think that the mayors are legitimate, even though they were elected by more voters than voted for the provincial government.
Yeah. It's true, though, that in Ontario, I see this everywhere I travel, that yes, these mayors were given special powers to direct budgets, come up with their own budgets too, but not the resources to help them live up to what their citizens want them to do. So it's the same whole problem.
We didn't need strong mayors, we needed strong cities.
That's right. But we also need provincial governments that will eventually recognize that. I do think, though, if I felt any... when I look at food security, because the show is partly about that, it's really an urgent time. It's rising up to the homeless kind of level, and it's really difficult. But I will say that for average citizens, it's beginning to impact them. And it's not just the homeless that they see on the streets, but now they can't afford food or rent prices are so high or whatever. So I guess what I'm saying is if we're going to see a change in this, it would be nice if the senior levels would recognize what's been going on. But in the absence of that, it's also true that the citizens are now probably more agitated by what they are seeing than they have in a long time. And if they wish to press their advantage, cities and communities would be the place that they would do that in, because that's where they do gather and that's where they live. So
the good news is they can get away without funding these critical things and then blame it on the cities. Mm-hmm. So here in Alberta, as everywhere, we're having serious concerns with social disorder as a result of the mental health and addictions crisis. Yeah. And the province just blames it on the city. You're not policing this properly. You're allowing this to happen when in fact, the root cause of all of this is the province just completely absconding its responsibilities in mental health and addiction. Food security, which you've been working on for so long, is such a critical part of this. I do this often when I'm speaking to groups. I say, how many of us in the last 2 weeks have complained about the price of groceries? And, 100% of people put up their hands, right? And then I say, for most of us, we're lucky enough that it's a complaint, it's an irritant, but for far too many of our neighbors, this increase in grocery prices is forcing them to make incredibly tough decisions about how they feed their family, about how they make choices for what their kids are able to do. And it is leading to, after a period where we cut the rate of child poverty by almost 70 or 80% in Canada, we're leading to a place where creeping poverty is going through our communities, hitting people who go to work every day, who make a good income every day, and who are now deeply unsettled because the deal is broken. The deal always was, look, if I go to work every day and I work hard, then I will have enough to have a good life. I can have a life without economic fear. I can have a life where my kids will be better off than I am. And now, for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, we believe that kids graduating high school today will probably be less financially well off than their parents. And this is deeply unsettling. We're not used to this. This completely goes against the narrative of the capitalist society in which we live. And people are feeling unmoored And I think a lot of politicians across the country are taking advantage of that unmooring to try and give people a new anchor and belief in themselves. But it's a very, very dangerous game.
Yeah.
So I often say, if you're the current leader of the opposition federally and you're encouraging everyone, don't trust anyone except for me, well, you know what's going to happen is at some point they're not going to trust you.
Yeah.
Ask my former premier, Jason Kenney, how well that worked.
Yeah.
And at the end, he was saying, oh, these people have taken over the asylum, right? And my only response was, I don't know if the arsonist is allowed to call the fire department.
Mm-hmm. What is the answer, though, Naheed? Like, I feel it is within communities, and yet communities themselves are so divided. And you're right about politics; it seeks to divide them in order to continue to maintain their advantage. But what is the answer? What would you suggest? You studied it a lot. You're way more intelligent than I am in this stuff. How do you see us then moving forward to at least begin the process of reversing that situation?
Well, strangely, I have surprised myself by going back into politics. So I think that's because I find a need to be optimistic. Partisan politics is weird for me, Glenn, because I've never been that way. I think I have a little purple on that you can see. I wear purple every day because not because it's a mix of liberal red and conservative blue, but because it's an invitation to people to give up their ideology, their past, their tribalism, and to join in what I call the muscular middle, which is not a left-right statement, but a statement which is an invitation to define ourselves by our common humanity.
Yeah.
So when I jumped back into politics, I thought, geez, this isn't going to work. I'm out of style now, right? Because the kind of politics that are critical now are the kind of politics that are deeply divisive. And so I was deeply worried. But I got to tell you, I've been back in politics a grand total of 6 weeks. And in those 6 weeks, I've seen the beginnings of a massive movement across this province. And it's a movement of people who say, for the first time in a decade of dirty, bad politics, I'm feeling a sense of optimism. I'm feeling a sense of hope. I'm feeling a sense that things can be better. And you're an Albertan, Glen, so you know that the best thing about living here is we live under an endless, endless sky. Mm-hmm. And I always say it is impossible to have dreams that are small when the sky is that big. Mm-hmm. And so I know this sounds very softy-wafty, but in reality, I think people are looking for leaders to help them remind them of their better angels, to help remind them of who we are in community and what we stand for in community. And so there's a lot of technical answers to your question. I always say there are 3 things that municipalities need from the federal government, which is their money, and their money. Mm-hmm. The federal government doesn't do much, with all due respect to a former MP, but they have all the money. The municipalities get 7 to 8 cents of every tax dollar that people spend, but they have all the responsibilities that keep people alive every day. And the clean water, roads, transit, all of it. And then the provinces are supposed to look after the human aspects, health, education, social services. But across the country and every flavor of government, they have been reneging on these responsibilities, leaving the municipalities to pick up the pieces. Yeah. And so there needs to be new fiscal frameworks, and I can get super technical about that. The property tax as constituted in most provinces in this country is deeply regressive, but it is the only source of revenue that the municipalities have. Yeah. And the reason the provinces and the municipalities like the property tax is because it's also the only source of revenue that is very, very predictable. Yeah. It doesn't go up and down like income tax does or sales tax does. So we've got to be brave enough to figure out a brand new fiscal framework, but it also starts with respect. So, when I hear Mr. Poilievre talk about municipal gatekeepers, I sort of laugh a little bit because I wonder if he realizes the gatekeepers he's talking about are typically the most conservative members of city councils and who have not gotten the memo that they actually need to be in favor of building things now. But it's just divisive language. Instead of saying, all right, we've got some very serious problems around affordability, around poverty, around mental health and addiction, around economic inequity. around the concept of equity more broadly writ, anti-racism and reconciliation. And of course, we're doing all of that in the backdrop of a very serious environmental crisis in which the world is looking to Canada to be leaders, not bystanders or also-rans. And so times are tough. But I also believe that precisely the fact that we're dealing with all of these issues at the same time
that's how I feel.
that we're living in a moment, and you've heard me say this before, we're living in a moment of extraordinary creativity.
Yeah.
I call it a wet clay moment because the pandemic in particular has upended our expectations on how society works. 4 years ago, you and I would never be filming this community TV thing from my dining room. Right? Technology, AI, everything is changing how the world works fast. But I believe that gives us what I call this wet clay moment, a moment where we get to create our future. But the thing about wet clay is if you don't mold it when it's wet, it dries and it hardens. And then it's impossible to remold without breaking everything. So the question I have for all of our communities is, are we ready to be better than our politics and our politicians? Are we ready to take this opportunity to mold our future in a way that's better for everybody? And I think very few people in leadership roles are inviting and encouraging people to ask these questions. And I think that's really what we have to do.
If we don't ask those questions, because I do think people are at where you say the majority of people are there, they're befuddled, perplexed with everything. But if that doesn't happen, then what does end up happening is kind of a partisanship and negativity bleeds down into the populace itself, right? They don't like it when they see it in Ottawa or when they see it in Queen's Park or up in Edmonton, right? But they kind of become like that because they look to politics to provide solutions and resources, and it doesn't happen. And then the populace itself begins to turn negative. And it's that inability to find a voice in the middle of all the voices that's really difficult, I think. And I do think that's a politician's responsibility, especially these days.
Well, in nature abhors a vacuum. Yeah. And so that vacuum is being filled by partisanship and tribalism, which is in and of itself very dangerous. And we're seeing it in all orders of government. So, when I say that kindness and empathy are really hard right now, and I say empathy is really hard right now because, those people crazy. They don't listen to reason. They don't listen to science. They're so stuck in their ideology that they cannot talk to other people. And when I say that, I invite people to say, who did you picture when I said that? I know who I pictured, probably the same people that you pictured, Glen, right? Folks on the streets of Ottawa in a cold winter a couple of years ago. But there are others who, when I say the exact same words, will picture drag queens reading to kids. And so what we have to understand is that the divisiveness is cutting across our society. We're encouraged to think of the other side as the other, right? Not as people that we need to reach out to. And empathy is so hard right now, but we have to force ourselves into it. And we need leaders, I think. And it's funny for me saying this because I'm aspiring to political leadership again. But as I've been out of politics all this time, I've been saying to folks that we need leaders who remind us that everything we built in this country, we built together. In rural Alberta, you don't get a barn up unless your neighbors come and help you build the barn. And somehow we have to go back to that place. And it's going to be a hard slog. The reason I'm back in politics now is because enough people said to me, look, you have a very limited set of skills. There's not very many things you're good at. But, don't fix my car, please. But all of us are called upon in this critical moment when we're so exhausted by being beat up so much. We're called upon in this critical moment to not be bystanders, to take whatever skills we have to try and build this better community. And for me, that limited set of skills is standing at a microphone and talking to people and trying to convince them of stuff. So here we are.
Well, we're out of time, Naheed. I knew this would happen. I just was dreading it.
We've got to one of your many questions.
No. I just so much enjoy talking to you because it's at a different level. It's at a citizen level, and I feel hope at that level. It does involve politics, but right now politics is not sensitive to that. and I get that. But I'll continue to feel hope for it because people like you are around, and you're willing to get back into the trenches. You're not just somebody with opinions; you're doing something about it, and I really appreciate that and deeply respect it. Thank you for doing this today. I'll continue to follow what you're doing, and maybe someday when you got time, we'll
Glenn.
get back
Let's
together.
keep talking. Let me say to you and to all your listeners, thank you for your seva. Thank you for your service.
Yeah.
And particularly thank you to you and Jane and your wonderful